Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's July 2nd, 2026. I'm your host, Eric White, filling in for Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up this hour of the Federal Drive, if you've ever struggled to hear someone in a crowded room, you've experienced a problem today's technology still hasn't solved. Researchers are now taking a different approach. Plus, what it's like when a government architecture project wades into political waters. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Trump administration is giving agencies more leeway to remove federal employees deemed unfit for their jobs. A new final rule from the Office of Personnel Management expands the reasons that employees might be considered unsuitable and therefore fireable. The change is meant to increase employee accountability, but concerns remain about the possibility of politically motivated removals. Here with more, Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Eric.
So suitability and fitness, that can mean a lot of things for a lot of different avenues. What have these regulations looked like historically when they've applied those terms?
Yes, so suitability and fitness for the federal workforce and in federal regulations means something very specific. And historically, what this means is that an agency gets to determine when they're hiring a new employee whether that person has the right character and conduct to perform their work and that they're not going to be potentially susceptible to misconduct in their jobs. Those regulations historically have been applied only to federal job applicants before they are hired and when agencies are considering whether to recruit them for both the competitive and accepted services, as well as the senior executive service. But once hired, historically, federal employees are subject to other disciplinary proceedings and not these suitability and fitness determinations. So that's what OPM is really changing here with this final rule.
Yeah, what are the changes exactly with the final rule? Are they just expanding who they can deem unfit and unsuitable, or is something else in the works?
So you can look at it as three main changes that are coming from this final rule. One is that these suitability and fitness regulations are going to apply to both current federal employees as well as prospective employees who are applying for a job. It's also, secondly, going to expand the number of reasons that employees can be found unfit or unsuitable for their jobs. And then finally, it's going to give OPM itself more authority in the process and the final say in determining whether employees are suitable or not. So those are the three buckets. But if you look specifically at the number of reasons that employees can be found unsuitable, I think it's worth looking at what OPM is expanding there. So historically, agencies are required to consider an employee's record of criminal or violent conduct, their alcohol use, instances of deception or fraud in their employment history. But then on top of that, the new regulations will now require agencies to look at a lot of other factors. That includes whether employees file their taxes on time, whether they meet U.S. citizenship requirements, if they properly are using government resources. And then most importantly, perhaps, is that now the final rule is also going to allow agencies to remove employees if they refuse to comply with a non-disclosure obligation. And if you'll remember, Eric, this is coming just a few weeks after OPM has also proposed a government-wide NDA for federal employees. So I think the context there is important to point out, and that this could be a reason if federal employees decide not to sign that type of form, they could be susceptible to removal under these new regulations as well.
Talking here with Federal News Network reporter Drew Friedman. Is this all being done in the name of being able to increase employee accountability, or did OPM give another reason for these changes?
Accountability is absolutely part of it, and that's definitely a common talking point from OPM and from the Trump administration more broadly. But they also argue in this final rule that Adverse action processes should be the same between both federal applicants and active federal employees. And then they also talk about this broader view that there are poor performers in government and there need to be easier ways to remove poor performers if they do pop up. And OPM in the final rule also said that the current employee removal procedures fall short of what agencies need and are too difficult to use. So that's why they're essentially creating another avenue here for agencies to, assess federal employees and determine, more options potentially to remove them if they feel like they're not meeting those standards.
And what has been the reaction from the federal community and the folks that will actually be under these new rules?
There's absolutely been pushback on this final rule from OPM, and as well as when they first proposed these regulations last year. But there are concerns that this would remove due process rights from federal employees who generally, when they're being removed, to have certain rights that need to be followed, such as a notification of being removed and the opportunity to respond to it. There are also concerns that this could pave the way for politically motivated firings in government. And then there were also comments talking about the existing disciplinary proceedings, which are called Chapter 75, just for a technical term. But, there's an argument there that those are already sufficient to be able to remove active federal employees, and you don't really need this second pathway. So that's kind of the response that we've seen and just some concerns about how it might reshape or build on other efforts from the Trump administration to make employees easier to fire.
Final W, where else is OPM looking to implement these changes related to suitability and fitness other than the direct hiring of federal employees?
Absolutely. So on top of these final regulations here that look to sort of change the process for suitability and fitness and expand that to federal employees, OPM is also looking on the other end of the spectrum to change the process for suitability appeals. That's already just a proposed regulation, so we haven't seen that finalized yet. But the idea there is, for example, if you're an employee who gets fired or removed from your job for a suitability related reason, and you believe that your agency didn't act correctly in that removal, then when you appeal that, currently that goes to the Merit Systems Protection Board. But what OPM is trying to change here is to make itself at OPM the deciding factor in those appeal cases rather than have it be at the MSPB independently. So that's another change that I think we're likely going to see coming up pretty soon from OPM here.
Federal News Network reporter Drew Friedman, thanks as always.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And you can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, what it's like when a government architecture project wades into political waters. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High-Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure, cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure, serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. We are now starting to see some of the changes to the FAR being implemented in real time. There are, of course, still many questions to be answered during such a large transition phase. To discuss them, I recently caught up with Emily Murphy, former administrator for the General Services Administration and now senior fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting. I also had the chance to pick her brain about what happens when a government architecture project wades into political waters. Emphasis on the water portion there. Let's start in that FAR rewrite. More is coming out from that. We're starting to see some cases develop from there, and we're starting to get some clarity, if you want to call it that, on what of the marching orders for what is kind of a new acquisition workforce due to the, just the necessity because of the workforce reductions. From your view, where do things currently stand?
So if you remember, this all sort of kicked off last year April, we got the executive orders saying we're going to rewrite the FAR. We're going to take a whole new approach to government contracting. They started putting out those model deviations last summer. They completed the model deviations before September 30th, and then things sort of went silent. So last week, on the 19th of June, we ended up hearing or getting the first 4 FAR cases, which encompassed about 17 parts of the FAR that came out with as proposed rules. So this is the first chance we've got to actually go through a traditional rulemaking process. And it's exciting because it means we're actually making progress towards getting what's been done by deviation into a normal process so that we're going to get to a new state of normal around the regulations. I have to give the FAR Council credit also because one of the things they did that I thought was really well done is on the acquisition.gov website, they put in a "we said you did." So they took the comments they got on those deviations and said, all right, we heard you on this. This is why we made the changes in those proposed rules. And so they put some additional information out there. I mean, one of them, for example, is just in the very beginning that said originally that each of the FAR cases that they were going to come out with, that they thought that everything should expire in 4 years and you should be constantly revisiting it. And they came back and said, okay, no, we listened to you all. We're not going to do that anymore. So they pull it out case by case, part by part, say, here's what we listened to you all on and here's what we did. The other interesting thing they did was they pulled in some old FAR cases that hadn't really made it all the way through the process. For example, there was one from 2017 on CUI. It triggers a lot of the information that's going on with CMMC over at the Department of War, on the CUI policies coming out of GSA, on the old Section 889, which you're calling it old, that's from 6 years ago, Section 889 on telecom, the Kaspersky information, pulls it all together into one part and gives a new set of proposed rules. And it's interesting because they mainly defer to the CMMC rules, but CMMC uses NIST version 2, whereas GSA was using NIST version 3. And the FAR case sort of says, well, we'll use version 3 when DOD says to, or DOW says to. And it, says, all right, we're going to do the, what's the period for notifications? Is it 3 days? Is it 1 day? And it again defers to the Department of War in the 3 days, but seems to leave it open for agencies to come in and have a lower reporting period. So if we're looking to standardize, this might be an area where companies might want to be commenting and looking at this and trying to really understand how it's going to apply and how much uniformity are we going to get across the contracting community. I was going to say, also, if we're looking at CMMC, you've seen over in Congress, but the House and the Senate have been looking at how do we help companies comply with things like CMMC? And they've been looking at that from a Department of War standpoint. No one's really looked at it from a civilian agency standpoint. Do we have the 3 PAOs, the third-party authorization groups, in place to do this kind of certification, the verifications? So it raises a lot of process questions going forward. It's going to be really interesting to see how this rulemaking develops.
Yeah, it seems as if there's so many unique set of circumstances for each agency. And as you mentioned, we've already had those workforce reductions that is causing some internal troubles there just because it takes a while to get new acquisition workers up to speed. But while getting them up to speed, there are also these model deviations. I mean, how do you navigate through what has been, a tough transition so far?
And I'll say FAI, the Federal Acquisition Institute, Defense Acquisition University, the FAR Council have done a really nice job of when they put out those model deviations, trying to put out a lot of just-in-time training. They had their practitioner album. They had a lot of information. But the amount of training you want to do on a model deviation or even an implemented deviation is probably not the full extent of training you'd want to do on a fully implemented new regulation under the full process. So once the FAR case is finalized. So we're in what I was talking to Polly Hall at GSA and Joni Newhart from the Office of Federal Procurement Policy last week, and they were calling it the messy middle. So we've got the deviations out there, and we know sort of a general direction of where we're going. We've had some additional executive orders on things like commercial acquisition and fixed price acquisition. So those are going to be integrated in. And now we have these FAR cases coming out and the proposed rules. So they're not going to want to go and do a whole new set of training on proposed rules. They're going to want to wait till they get to final rule. So how do you right now you'd be training people on the deviations, which might be different from agency to agency. For contractors, this is an issue as well, because it's not just the acquisition workforce in the agencies that have to adopt and adapt to these rules. But at the same time, they've got to be planning ahead for, okay, if this is where the FAR is going, how are we going to be ready to implement that? And when is that going to be effective?
Seems as if, it's the FAR's time it's moved out of its parents' house, right? It doesn't know. It's a lot of stuff on the table right now.
It is that messy middle, and I'll give you an example. Like with the reduced workforce, there's a lot of promise behind AI and using AI tools to supplement the workforce, make them more efficient. But you can't really train AI until you've decided what rules you want it to follow. So, if you want AI to be following the new Part 40 that's proposed, you're going to need to train it on that rather than training it on the old set of rules. And until we're there, there's going to be more muddling along, I think.
Speaking with former GSA Administrator Emily Murphy. And while we have you, I wanted to touch on something a little more mainstream, and that is the ongoing updates going to the reflecting pool. Obviously, not going to ask you to comment on that since you're not involved whatsoever. But, when you have a project like this that is front-facing, that the American public can see the updates and upgrades happening in real time, and there are questions in the back side of, who's doing the actual work, how is the contract working? What agency is actually controlling this project? I'm curious to get your experience in that, as you had a couple just in your last few years with GSA, with the first Trump administration. Just wondering to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way that the federal space operates, especially in the National Capital Region. So if you think even about the White House complex itself, the West Wing is primarily managed by GSA, but then parts of it are operated for the mess is operated by the Navy. The Situation Room is a GSA space, but is operated by the intelligence community. The West Wing itself, though, it tends to be a GSA building. But then you go outside of the West Wing proper, and there's an MOU that goes back and forth between the executive residence, the National Park Service, GSA, that went down to what brick on the curb is whose responsibility. And it was always being renegotiated because first and foremost, you need to keep the president safe. And then you need to make this space operational. And so what's the most effective way to do it? So there's a lot of moving pieces in all of this. And when it seems like it would be obvious that contracting would be done in one place, it's not always obvious. It doesn't always work that way. Another example I'll give you is the tower at the old post office, which, if you remember back in the first administration, that was the Trump Hotel. It's now Waldorf Astoria. But at the time, that tower actually still is managed by the National Park Service. And we had a government shutdown while I was there. And one of the issues that came up was, well, why is that still open? Everyone thought there was some great story behind why it was still open. Why was the tower still open? The honest answer was that it was an MOU between whoever the lessor of the hotel was and the National Park Service, saying that because it was being paid for with non-appropriated funds, it was going to remain open. So the story is not always as exciting as people think it's going to be. It's usually a lot of people trying very hard to follow a lot of rules to get to the right outcome.
Yeah, and when it happens and then, political figures start getting involved, then design and architecture and project management start to get politicized, and people like yourself find themselves popping up in discussions that you never thought you were going to be found. What was that like for you?
Oh, it was fascinating. I still remember I had one senator who we were building courthouses in his state. And at the time, he was like, just please do not build me an Apple store. He did not want a courthouse that looked like an Apple store. And we had our normal design construction, like the art and architecture program, how it was going to operate. And so we were trying to go through and make sure that his needs and his, what he wanted was also following our process and our rules. And then, if you recall, the president at the end of the first administration signed an order saying we're going to change how we apply art and architecture. And then that got revoked in the Biden administration, and that got re-implemented again now. So the question of what architectural standards are you using? Is it classical architecture? And what do we mean by classical architecture? The one question we frequently had was, all right, when you look around DC, which buildings do you consider classical? There are very few that are truly classical, and a lot of the old executive office building, the Eisenhower building, No one had a problem with the architecture there, but that's not classical architecture. It's Beaux-Arts, second Empire architecture. So what exactly is it, trying to get as specific as possible, get people to talk with the same vocabulary about what they're looking for in design and how they want that to play out. We had the same problem with the St. Elizabeth campus over at the Department of Homeland Security. There was an enormous effort to maintain the historic, character of that property. But you also discover that when some of the buildings were built by patients who had no background in construction, that there are a lot more issues. We had to go under the headquarters building, put a new foundation in. The facade around the main building now has another wall inside of it to support it, which makes some of the rooms sort of narrow because in order to keep that facade, you had to build essentially a building inside of a building. And so how do you make those trade-offs where you want to protect the past, but you also want to have a fully functional space that meets the needs of the department or agency that's going to be there, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well?
Emily Murphy is former GSA administrator and now senior fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting. We'll post this interview at our website. Head to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the Army is giving commanders more input than ever on acquisition decisions. But first, if you've ever struggled to hear someone in a crowded room, you've experienced a problem today's technology still hasn't solved. Researchers are now taking a different approach. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Back on the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Even advanced hearing aids and implants can fall short when it comes to separating voices from background noise. A new federal research program is looking beyond the ear and into the brain for answers. Federal Drive host Terry Gerton got more from Dr. Calvin Roberts, the hearing program manager at ARPA-H.
Certainly one of the topics that a lot of people are concerned about as they age is the loss of hearing. And there are advanced hearing aids, implants, but still it's tough in noisy environments. ARPA-H has just rolled out a new program called the Hearing Enhancement Through Artificially Intelligent Neurotechnology. You guys get an A+ for acronyms, the Hearing Program. Tell me about what the Hearing Program is and what problem it's trying to solve that current hearing aids can't really address.
So as you said, hearing is ubiquitous among older people. And so we're looking at least 70 million Americans who are having trouble with their hearing. So what are their options? Well, really, the only option that's out there is a hearing aid. And what does a hearing aid do? A hearing aid amplifies the sound, so as if they're shouting in your ear. Now, for some people, that's great. And particularly in a room that is quiet. So if you're at home and you're watching TV or you're talking to someone one-on-one in a quiet environment, hearing aids are excellent. But the problem that most people have, and the number one complaint that I hear from people with hearing aids, is that they're not helpful in noisy environments. And so it's hard to separate speech from background noise. The people in this industry, they refer to this as the cocktail party dilemma, that if you're in a noisy environment, you can't separate the conversation that's happening on one side of you from the conversation that's happening on the other side of you, and it makes it hard. Terry, there's two situations that I talk about all the time. And one of them is you go to a wedding and the older people say, the band's too loud. And the younger people say, no, the band's not loud at all. And they're both right. And then the other situation is the grandkids say, Grandpa, you're not hearing a word I'm saying. And Grandpa says, yes, I hear everything. And they're both right. So how could that be? How could that be that they're both right? Well, it starts out with what's the problem? What's happening when someone loses their hearing? Well, usually what it is there is a very slow, gradual deterioration of the inner ear. And the inner ear is where the sound gets, we call it transduced, where it gets transformed from sound waves into an electrical type of signal, the type of signal that your brain can understand. So your ear turns the sound into a signal that goes to your brain, much as the way as your eyes take a light signal and transform that into a signal that goes to your brain. So what happens is that with this deterioration in your ear, now the signal to your brain gets deteriorated as well, because there's not as good information coming in, can't send as good a signal to your brain. So what does your brain do? Your brain turns up the gain. It just makes everything seem louder. And so the same sound to someone with ear deterioration actually sounds louder than to someone without. And so that's why the band sounds louder to older people, because the brain of older people has just turned up the gain and everything is louder in order to hear better. Right. So what do we want to do? Here's what we want to do is we want to turn down the gain. We want the brain to go back to the way it was functioning when the person was younger. So how do we do that? We do that by improving the signal that's coming to the brain. Because remember, that gain was turned up because of the fact that the signal wasn't so good. If we can improve the signal, now the brain says, oh, I don't have to work so hard. I don't have to work so hard. I can turn down the gain and I can hear more normally. So what are we going to do? What we're going to do is put a small little chip in your brain, a little computer chip in your brain. And what the chip is going to do is it's going to listen to what you want to hear. And then it's going to say, okay, here's what you're missing. Here's what your ear is not being able to transmit to you that you want to hear. And so then what it's going to do is it's going to be able to directly stimulate in your brain that which your ear can't transmit. And so you're going to go back to having this full, rich sound like you had when you were a young person. And as that sound improves, now you won't have to work so hard. And we don't have to work so hard.
Dr. Calvin Roberts is the Hearing Program Manager at ARPA-H. That is fascinating. And I can think about lots of people who are going to be very excited about that. But it also sounds like quite a challenge technologically. What's the biggest obstacle that you have to overcome in the technical space to go from just a hearing aid to a brain chip that's going to do this kind of work?
Well, there's two things. One is the technical, and the second is the patient acceptance. And let's do the patient acceptance first. In planning this program, we spoke to a lot of people who are having trouble with their hearing. And we said to them, would you be willing to have a chip put in your brain if it would help you hear? And our answer was almost universal. The people say, yes, I'd have a chip in my brain, but not if you had to drill a hole in my skull in order to get it there. So part of our program is to be able to deliver this chip where we want it in your brain without cutting a hole in your head. So say, well, how would you do that? I think the analogy is to hearts. So it's not that long ago when someone wanted to repair a heart, they had to break open the chest, cut it open, do triple bypass type of thing in order to get access. Today, how's it done? People just feed little stents in through an artery or a vein, and they feed that stent in there type of thing, and it can do most of what a big surgery could do. Well, we're going to use that same idea and that same technology to be able to put these chips into the brain without having to drill a hole into the skull. And so hopefully, if we can do this and people go, oh, all right, this doesn't seem so bad, I'd go for this. And if I really thought it was going to help the hearing. Now, so that's the patient acceptance. But your first question was, what's the real technical challenge here? So the technical challenge is a couple. First of all, because we're not looking for a treatment solely for people who have no hearing at all. What we want to do is we want to maximize that which you're currently able to hear and just supplement it with that which you cannot hear and have both of these signals delivered to your brain at exactly the same time. So sync them. Because you don't want one signal coming and then a half a second later another signal comes with delay. That would be too hard. So you got to get the signals to both get there at the same time. So that's number one. Number two is you got to realize that this is a journey and that people lose their hearing slowly over time. And so this is going to be a totally adaptable system so that as your ears change, as it becomes harder and harder for you to hear, the chip will work and do more of it for you so that you won't really realize that your hearing has changed because the quality of your hearing is going to stay the same, even as you start losing more hearing over time.
This is just the beginning of the program. You've just announced it. What sort of timeline are you looking on?
Yeah, so it's really exciting because there are so many people out there, really clever neuroscientists, technical people, computer whiz people who all have an interest in this. And at ARPA-H, we really specialize on programs that require teams of people. And so we're asking people to put together teams of computer people and medical people and AI people and put them all together. And so we are expecting to get some really, really fabulous proposals.
And once you get the proposals, is this a 5-year program to prototype, or what are you thinking about?
Yeah, so I think we're looking at about 4.5 years in order to go from the beginning to get something that is ready for patients.
Well, I'm hopeful after folks listen to this that you won't at least have any shortage of applicants to be patients in the program.
Well, as I always say, thank you for hearing.
Calvin Roberts is the hearing manager at ARPA-H. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the Army is giving commanders more input than ever on acquisition decisions. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. When an Army commander needs a war-fighting capability, he or she now has a place to go get it fast. The place is the Global Tactical Edge Acquisition Directorate, or GTED. Launched officially in November, GTED's mission is to fill technology gaps based on soldiers' needs and relieving commanders of the challenges of the acquisition and funding processes. For more on how GTED is already bringing new and emerging technology to the Army, Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller talked to Colonel Christopher Hill, the director of the Global Tactical Edge Acquisition Directorate with the Army.
For GTED, if you were to look into the regulation, we reside left of an actual requirement. And because of that, that allows me to use dollars to procure combat-ready prototype systems. So whereas, I'll give you a very real, for instance. So there are two specific capabilities that have come directly from GTED. The first one you may have heard about is called MIROPS. MIROPS is what was billed as the Shaheed killer in Ukraine. Back in September, there was a Russian incursion of one-way attack drones that flew into Polish airspace and Romanian airspace. The very next day, General Donahue came into the briefing room and said, I want that capability in the hands of our partners within 21 days. We immediately spun up. We went and did an assessment of the system, and it ended up taking us somewhere around 27, 28 days, but we were able to work with the company to physically put that capability on the eastern flank of Europe to be prepared for those one-way drones if and when they came in. That went from GTED to JIATA 401, who has the counter-UAS mission, picking up that capability, and they went and they bought 13,000 of them. Of the 13,000, now you see that MIROP system at work in Arcent right now, protecting soldiers from potential shaheeds in Epic Fury. We just had another system, FD1, which is another quadcopter drone killer that went through the entire GTED process. And my initial purchase of that is going to be 300 of those systems. GTED will come in and make another purchase, maybe of 500. While all of this is going on, we're working with the Army, we're working with the PAEs to determine, is this a system that answers a larger Army need? And if it does, it will transition to a program office, to a PM. MIROPS transition all the way from what we talked about in September. It is now with a PM. There is a PM that has MIROPS. FD1, we're looking to do the exact same thing. The ground autonomous systems I talked about earlier, we're on the precipice of awarding that contract. So our success criteria is not just, hey, how many of an MVP or how many prototypes that we can put in the hand of a unit, is are we picking systems that can transition to the Army and scale across the Army? That's really what we view as success. But we are always going to buy a limited number of prototypes, enough that we can actually outfit some size unit to give it an effect on the battlefield.
And also to your point, like on the FD1, you bought 300 systems, and then if you're going to purchase 500, that 500 probably, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, it won't be the same as those initial 300 because of the lessons you have learned about applying those 300 systems either to the battlefield or some sort of test and trial. And that's why GTED is there to go back to the earlier parts of our conversation, to be that to have that flexibility and to iterate.
100%. And I will tell you that those types of conversations in a normal project office are not the conversations I'm having with a vendor. So FD1 is a very good example. We stood up the EFDI Forward Integration and Innovation Hub in Jordan at a place called Deep Element. We brought FD1 in. It went through an operational assessment. ATEC performed that operational assessment. So great partnership with ATEC. They are also moving forward with us to provide testing support at the edge, not back at White Sands or Yuma in some CONUS base range, but forward at the tactical edge. They tested the system, and they came up with 4 things that they would like to see the system do better. After the OA was over, the operational assessment was over, I had a phone conversation with Mountain Horse System, and they said, Colonel Hill, if you would allow us to delay delivery 2 weeks, all 4 of those things we will have fixed. They will be satisfied and they will be in the system. I said, absolutely. So that again is taking user feedback and doing something with it in a rapid fashion. And the expectation is, hey, your next 50 systems, they're going to look a certain way. The 50 after that, based upon more feedback, will be better and better and better. So these are the types of companies that we want to attract. That is a good news story. I mean, you're the first one to hear it publicly, but that is something that Mountain Horse Systems, very impressive. And guess what? When I'm talking to these companies, I'm not talking to a business developer. I'm not talking to, a lead engineer. I'm talking to the CEO. I'm talking to the person who has the most skin in the game. And this is mutually beneficial because for every Mountain Horse system that we have, it sends a signal to those venture capitalists, a signal to those that are supporting these smaller companies to say, we are going to work with these companies. It's a win-win. And it's not just the U.S. because now what can we say for this system? I can turn to every NATO partner and say, hey, we have a proven capability. If you want this in your company, in your country, here's the company. Do business with them. To all of the countries over in the Middle East, all of our partner nations over there, if you want more capability against an incoming threat from Iran, we've just vetted, we've just competed, and we have a company. So this is absolutely a win-win for some of the small and medium-sized businesses that we work with.
Let's talk a little bit about those businesses. One of the big complaints you hear about, for instance, other transaction authorities as just an example. They're supposed to be for up-and-coming companies you've never heard of, the new entrants. And then when you see all those awards being made, it's to companies you've definitely heard of and are by far not new entrants. How are you ensuring, and not everyone's got to be a new entrant, but how are you ensuring you are reaching out and finding those companies like Mountain Horse Systems that maybe would not otherwise have access or the capability or even the knowledge to enter the Army's market?
So this is where the brilliance of the pit comes into play. So as a member of the pit, we are direct teammates with the GIOP. But to answer your questions, we are direct teammates with Army Fuse. So Army Fuse is the portion of the pit that has the pulse of industry. So we do what is called prize challenges utilizing X-Tech, which is a part of Army Fuse. That prize challenge is what we use for our competition. Now, typically a prize challenge will say, hey, we're going to award you this prize money, and it puts you sort of on the map as someone who has a capability. Well, with GTED, we've kind of taken the next step. We use those prize challenges, but we incorporate them into what we call an ACE, an accelerated capability event. And what that ACE is the convergence of operational demand, innovation, soldier assessment. Soldiers are the ones actually using and operating the kit in our demonstrations, and then contract opportunity.
Colonel Christopher Hill is the director of the Global Tactical Edge Acquisition Directorate, or GTED, with the Army. Speaking there with Federal News Network Executive Editor Jason Miller. The CIA is looking to drastically speed up its acquisition timelines to acquire cutting-edge technology like AI. CIA Director John Ratcliffe says the goal is to complete most technology acquisitions within 6 months. And the secretive spy agency also wants to open up to industry through a new Office of Corporate Partnerships. For more on all of this, we turn to Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, welcome.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me.
All right, so speed. Everybody wants speed in their acquisition processes, it seems, nowadays. What's behind the CIA's push to get it?
Yeah, it's not necessarily surprising that the CIA would be really interested in quickly adopting new technologies. And part of the challenge, according to CIA Director John Ratcliffe, is the agency's really staid acquisition processes. He said that prior to being sworn in, the CIA was taking about 24 months to acquire a new enterprise technology, and then an additional 9 months on average for the security assessment for the technology to be authorized to go on CIA networks. So 2 to 3 years was what they were looking at. Now they're looking at 6 months, and that's something that Ratcliffe really emphasized during a keynote address at the AWS Summit in Washington this week. This was CIA Director John Ratcliffe's first really major speech since being sworn in last January. And so it's really notable that he chose to go to a technology summit and to talk about technology. Kind of shows how important it is for him as CIA Director. Here's what he had to say.
Increasingly, all of our future successes are going to depend on technology. We have to continue to push the boundaries of what's possible, because the nation that best harnesses the power of technology will determine the global future.
Yeah, CIA Director John Ratcliffe there. Yeah, and as you mentioned, we haven't really heard much from him, and to have him come out and speak on this topic must mean he saw something he did not like. How is the CIA going to go about cutting down those acquisition timelines?
Well, it's interesting. The CIA about 6 months ago announced that they were starting this big acquisition overhaul that would speed things up. And that overhaul involves a centralized vendor vetting system, streamlined authorization processes to really speed up the security authorization, which is often that proverbial long pole in the tent for all government agencies, not just the CIA. And then really it's just about speeding up those internal processes, that red tape, and delegating down to the lowest possible level. That's what Ratcliffe said at the AWS summit, really making sure that those who are closest to the issues are the ones who are making the acquisition decisions. The CIA also has a new chief procurement executive that came over from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is an agency that is known for actually moving pretty quickly when it comes to acquisition and doing some innovative things. And so that's all to say that the CIA is really looking at that process and is overhauling that process in a lot of different ways. And already, Ratcliffe says it's paying off. He said that over the last 6 months, the CIA has completed just under 400 acquisitions in that time period. And so that's what they're aiming for now, is about 6 months or less to bring in new technologies.
Other agencies have done this by fomenting better relationships with industry. How is the company opening up to more companies than it has in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely a big emphasis for the CIA under John Ratcliffe. He said that the agency now has an Office of Corporate Partnerships. That is supposed to be a single point of access, as he put it, for industry to work with the agency, and most importantly, find someone to contact, because as you might imagine, it's difficult sometimes to find the right point of contact at the CIA. So there will be that kind of single place where industry can go if they're interested in learning more about what the CIA is doing. Now, it'll be interesting to see how the agency works through some of the issues around classification. That's always a challenge for non-traditional contractors, especially, who don't have that clearance to be able to view classified info, and all of the CIA's acquisitions are classified. So it'll be interesting to see how they work through that. But ultimately, Ratcliffe says the CIA is going to be a better partner for industry.
We recognize that when it comes to partnering with private industry, the CIA hasn't always been the easiest agency to work with because of both our security requirements and because we haven't always coordinated our outreach to individual companies very well.
And I imagine the push behind this as well is to try and get into those latest and greatest technologies that there are for federal agencies to utilize. What organizational changes is the agency looking to make in how it manages cyber, digital, all the newest and greatest stuff that everyone else is able to use freely?
Yeah, this was an interesting detail or set of details that Ratcliffe mentioned. So the CIA for several years now has had a Directorate of Digital Innovation, and this was established in the 2010s to, of course, sort of centralize how the CIA approached newer digital technologies when those were still kind of a new thing. Things like cloud were kind of a new thing for federal agencies. Now, the agency is reorganizing that directorate into the Directorate for Mission Systems. And so instead of focusing on all digital kind of technologies and widgets and things, the Directorate of Mission Systems, DMS, is going to be focused on kind of core functions, more of a CIO type function, if you will. They will be focused on cybersecurity, advanced data, and infrastructure services, which means things like cloud. And so you're going to see the DMS actually drop a focus on offensive cyber, on open source intelligence. They will not be focused on those kind of distinct technologies as much, and more on kind of setting a baseline for the rest of the CIA to adopt things like that securely. And then you have the Center for Cyber Intelligence, a relatively new center that the CIA has now elevated to a full-fledged mission center that brings together kind of the full range of operational, analytic support and technical capabilities into one place. And that CCI is focused on offensive cyber. And that is a huge part of the CIA's mission. It's a huge part of how they're probably going to be using artificial intelligence. And that is where the offensive cyber mission will really be living and elevated for the CIA going forward.
I was about to say, you mentioned all the hot button technology words in there except for artificial intelligence until the very end. I imagine Ratcliffe had something to say about CIA's approach to AI.
He did. It's interesting. I was hoping he might offer some use cases, but I guess I shouldn't expect too many specifics out of the CIA director. But he did talk about AI generally. He said it's transforming the way that the agency does business. it is really essential for the CIA to adopt AI quickly across its different operations and analytics operations. And so this is where Ratcliffe is really focused, is on letting the CIA kind of experiment a little bit more with AI than maybe it has been allowed to do in the past. Here's what he said.
While I can't predict just how fast AI and the other emerging technologies will advance or how far they're going to take us, what I can say is that we're going to do everything we can to deliver all of the top tools necessary for our officers to succeed, to keep America safe. What we're not going to do, as we test the limits of what is possible at the CIA, is to let perfect be the enemy of good. We're going to take smart risks, we're going to experiment, and then we're going to course correct as we go.
And again, that's CIA Director John Ratcliffe speaking at the AWS Summit in Washington this week.
All right, Federal News Network reporter Justin Doubleday, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And you can find more of Justin's reporting on this at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by me, Eric White, along with Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Thanks for listening.